I remember the sound of my own breathing. Not the way you remember a conversation or a face, but the way you remember pain on. Constant, inescapable, woven into every moment, until it becomes the rhythm by which you measure time. In the cockpit of a TIE fighter, your breath is amplified, recycled, fed back to you through the helmet's internal speakers with a mechanical hiss that never quite syncs with the actual movement of your lungs. It creates an echo, a half-second delay that makes you feel like you're listening to someone else dying slowly in a box beside you. That sound down, that wet, desperate rhythm, becomes the only thing separating you from the void. And after a while, you stop being able to tell which breath is your last comfortable one, and which is the first of your panic. They don't tell you that in the propaganda reels. The Imperial Naval Academy on Karita showed us TIE fighters as extensions of the Emperor's will as swift, elegant, absolute. They showed us victory formations screaming past star destroyers, showed us rebel corvettes breaking apart in silent flowers of fire and metal, showed us the crisp geometry of Imperial dominance stretching across every star system that mattered. What they didn't show us was the smell. That particular combination of recycled sweat, overheated electronics, and the sharp metallic tang that I learned much later was the scent of your own fear, leaching through your pores and condensing on the inside of your flight suit. They didn't show us how small the cockpit actually is, how your knees press against the control panels, how your shoulders touch both sides of the fuselage if you try to shift your weight. They didn't mention that the life support system is adequate for exactly 47 minutes of combat operation, and that adequate is a word Imperial engineers use when they mean technically sufficient to prevent immediate death. I was 19 standard years old when I first sat in a TIE fighter cockpit for real. Not a simulator. Not a training mock-up with the canopy removed and an instructor standing beside you with a datapad. The actual thing, sealed, ready for launch, sitting in the deployment rack of the Star Destroyer Relentless with 763 identical machines in identical racks stretching away into the hangar's fluorescent infinity. I remember thinking it looked smaller than I expected. Like a coffin built for someone my size exactly, with no room for growth, no room for error, no room for anything except the pilot and his duty. The crew chief who sealed my canopy was a thin man with a scar across his throat that suggested he'd survived something that should have killed him. He didn't speak. None of them spoke much. The deck crew, they moved with the efficiency of people who'd learned that hesitation in a Star Destroyer's launch bay could result in you being incinerated by engine wash or crushed by automated loading equipment, or simply forgotten in some corner while the ship jumped to hyperspace with you, still standing on the flight deck, holding a hydrospanner and wondering why the artificial gravity suddenly felt wrong. He checked my harness connections with hands that moved too fast to follow, slapped the side of my helmet twice, hard enough that my vision blurred, and then stepped back as the canopy sealed with a sound like a tomb closing. That's when I heard it for the first time. My breathing? Loud. Too loud. Filling the entire cockpit with its desperate rhythm, bouncing off the transparent steel viewport and the black walls, and the instruments that glowed with a dim red light, designed not to ruin your night vision, but which instead made everything look like you were already looking at it through blood. I tried to slow it down, tried to breathe the way they taught us in atmospheric flight training ground, measured, controlled, tactical breathing to maintain focus during high-stress maneuvers. But the helmet amplified everything. Every slight catch in my throat. Every moment where my lungs hitched because some part of my brain that still understood self-preservation was screaming that I was trapped in a machine that had no ejection system, no shields, no redundant life support, no armor worth mentioning, and was about to be flung into a combat zone where rebel pilots flew ships that could take a dozen direct hits and still limp home, while a single lucky shot would turn me an expanding planet. The comm crackled. Gold 7, you are go for deployment? Acknowledge. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, filtered through the helmet speakers, bouncing back at me with that same half-second delay. Gold 7 acknowledges. Ready for deployment. I wasn't ready. Nobody was ever ready. But ready wasn't a state of being in the Imperial Navy. It was a word you said because the alternative was admitting fear, and fear was treason, and treason was the airlock or worse our assignment to a Panel Legion where you die just as certainly, but without even the cold dignity of a pilot's death. The deployment rack lurched. Hydraulics hissed somewhere below me, and the entire TIE fighter dropped 3 meters in a controlled fall that made my stomach try to exit through my throat. Through the viewport, I could see the magnetic launch rail stretching out toward the atmospheric containment field. That shimmer of energy that was the only thing between the hangar and hard vacuum. Beyond it, space. Not the romantic darkness of the propaganda posters, but an enormous indifferent black scattered with stars that were too distant to matter, and the gray bulk of the Relentless's sister ship, the Inexorable, holding position 3,000 kilometers to our starboard. I could see the running lights of other TIE fighters already in patrol formation, tiny crosses of light moving with a precision that looked almost peaceful from this distance. Gold Squadron, this is launch control. You are cleared for deployment on my mark. Mission parameters are uploaded to your navicomputers. Acknowledge in sequence. One by one, the pilots of Gold Squadron confirmed. Gold Leader, his voice smooth and unbothered. The voice of a man who'd survived 50 combat drops and believed he'd survive 50 more. Gold 2 through Gold 6. Their acknowledgments crisp and professional. The voices of people who'd learned to hide their fear so well, they might have forgotten it was there. Then me. Gold 7. The new pilot. Dot. The replacement for the previous Gold 7, who died 4 days ago during a rebel raid on an Imperial convoy near Ryla. Nobody told me how he died. Nobody had to. There were only so many ways a TIE fighter pilot could die, and all of them were fast, and all of them were certain, and all of them ended with you being replaced within 72 hours by another pilot who'd sit in your cockpit and try not to think about the fact that the seat still smelled like someone else's fear. Gold 7 acknowledges, I said, and my voice didn't shake, and I was proud of that for approximately 3 seconds before I realized that pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. The launch rail engaged. I felt it more than heard it taut, a thrumming vibration that traveled up through the TIE fighter's frame and into my spine, turning my bones into tuning forks resonating at a frequency that made my teeth ache. The electromagnetic accelerators were charging, building power, preparing to fling 63,000 kilograms of starfighter and pilot out into the void at a velocity sufficient to clear the capital ship's mass shadow and give us maneuvering room before the rebels arrived. If they arrived. Intelligence said there was a 60% chance of rebel activity in this sector. 60%? As if you could quantify the likelihood of your death with the same mathematics you'd use to calculate hyperspace jump coordinates. Mark, said Launch Control, and the universe contracted into a single point of overwhelming acceleration. The launch rail fired. The TIE fighter shot forward with a force that crushed me back into the seat despite the inertial compensators, compressed my lungs, turned my vision gray at the edges, made my heartbeat sound like thunder in my ears underneath the constant hiss of my own breathing. The hangar blurred past deck crew frozen in mid-gesture. Other TIE fighters waiting their turn, the geometric precision of Imperial military architecture, reducing itself to streaks of gray and white and red. And then the containment field. That moment of resistance like pushing through something solid, a sensation of pressure and heat, and a sound like tearing metal that existed only inside your head. And then, space. Actual space. The electromagnetic catapult released, and suddenly the crushing acceleration was gone, replaced by the stomach-dropping sensation of freefall, of being a single fragile object in an ocean of nothing with only your fighter's twin-ion engines and your own questionable competence standing between you and eternity. I remembered to breathe. The training took over. Automatic responses drilled into us through 10,000 simulator hours until they bypassed conscious thought entirely. Hands moving across controls, adjusting attitude thrusters, bringing the fighter into alignment with Gold Squadron's formation pattern. The ion engines thrummed to life, their distinctive howl transmitted through the fuselage as vibration rather than sound. You couldn't hear engines in vacuum, but you could feel them, feel the power cycling through the systems, feel the fighter responding to your inputs with a responsiveness that was almost organic. TIE fighters were fast, faster than almost anything the rebels could field. Faster than X-Wings, faster than A-Wings, certainly faster than the lumbering Y-Wings that rebel cells used for bombing runs. Speed was our advantage. Speed and numbers and the absolute certainty that the Empire would replace us faster than the rebels could kill us. That was the doctrine. That was what they taught us. Acceptable losses. Tactical attrition. Magi, no. Victory through overwhelming force, and the willingness to spend lives like currency in service of galactic order. I took my position in the formation. One Layum Tamar Surdasu. Gold, 7 town. The slot on the far left of the second flight, a position that meant I'd be covering Gold 5's flank during attack runs and absorbing fire, meant for more experienced pilots when the situation deteriorated. Because it would deteriorate. It always deteriorated. Intelligence reports, and tactical briefings and careful mission planning all collapsed the moment actual combat began. And then you were just a person in a box trying not to die while the universe threw superheated plasma at you from directions your training swore were supposed to be safe. Gold Squadron, maintain patrol pattern Delta 4, Gold Leader said, his voice calm through the comm system, filtered and mechanical, but still somehow human. Stay alert, Haini. Intelligence indicates possible rebel scout activity near the third moon. We splash anything that isn't broadcasting Imperial transponder codes. What? Understood? Understood, we replied in sequence, our voices overlapping slightly, creating a chorus of acknowledgement that sounded almost like prayer. The patrol pattern was a three-dimensional geometry problem. A constantly shifting arrangement of starfighters moving through space in formations calculated to provide maximum coverage of the Relentless's vulnerable approach vectors, while maintaining mutual fire support and minimizing the chance of friendly fire incidents. We flew it perfectly because we'd practiced it 1,000 times, because deviation from the pattern was grounds for disciplinary action, because the pattern was designed by tactical computers that understood warfare better than any human could, and to question the pattern was to question the Empire itself. So we flew in our designated positions, adjusting thrust and vector every few seconds, watching our sensors for the telltale signatures of rebel ships dropping out of hyperspace or emerging from behind the system's larger moons, trying not to think about the fact that we were essentially Baton-expensive, well-trained bait designed to draw out rebel forces, so the Star Destroyer's turbolaser batteries could reduce them to their component. The third moon hung in the viewport like a gray eye, pockmarked and lifeless, important only because its mass shadow created a convenient hyperspace exit point, and its surface was honeycombed with abandoned mining facilities that could hide a dozen rebel ships if they'd bothered to set up a base here. Probably they hadn't. Probably this was another routine patrol that would end with 6 hours of flight time, stiff muscles, and a return to the Relentless's hangar, where we'd wait for the next launch cycle, and the next mission, and the next incremental increase in the probability that this would be the day our luck ran out. I checked my life support readout. 39 minutes of oxygen remaining at current consumption rates. Standard procedure was to return to the carrier with no less than 15 minutes remaining, which gave us a comfortable operational window assuming nothing went wrong. When things went wrong, when combat began, when your breathing rate tripled, when you started pulling high G maneuvers that made your body consume oxygen faster than the recyclers could process it on, that 39 minutes could collapse to 20 or 15 or 10. I'd heard stories about pilots who'd won their engagements but run out of breathable air before they could dock, who'd beaten the rebels but lost to their own biology, who'd died listening to their own increasingly desperate breathing, slow and stop, while their fighter drifted, intact and victorious, just outside the hangar's containment field. They didn't retrieve the bodies immediately. Procedure was to let them drift until the after-action report was filed and the proper forms were completed, and someone from logistics determined whether it was more cost-effective to recover the fighter with a tractor beam or simply list it as combat loss and build a new one. Usually, they built a new one. TIE fighters were cheap. Pilots were cheaper. The Empire had 17,000 naval academies across 1 million worlds, all of them producing a steady stream of young men and women who'd been taught that service was honor, and honor was dying in a cockpit, and dying in a cockpit was the highest purpose a human life could achieve. I believed that once. Before Carida, Siders. Before the training, before the first time I sat in a simulator and experienced a virtual death, console flashing red, the canopy filled with the white light of a reactor breach, the simulation freezing and resetting and starting over, while an instructor's voice reminded us that we just failed, and failure was unacceptable, and the only way to avoid failure was to be faster, more willing to make the shots that would kill. Bell. We died hundreds of times in those simulators. Thousands of times. Every day for 8 months, we climbed into mock-up cockpits and fought virtual battles against AI-controlled rebel fighters that were programmed to fly exactly like the real thing. And every day we died, and every day we learned a little bit more about which maneuvers might buy us an extra few seconds, which attack angles had the highest probability of success, which rebel ship classes went down fastest, which rebel ship classes. They never told us that knowing how to kill efficiently and knowing how to survive weren't the same thing. Gold Leader's voice crackled through the comm. 1. Sensor contact at 2. Bearing 27, Mark 4. Single ship, frigate class, emerging from behind the moon's northern pole. Transponder code is not Imperial. Repeat, not Imperial. All Gold Squadron elements, weapons hot. Prepare for intercept on my mark. Nah. My hands moved before my brain finished processing the words. Training. Reflexes. The fighter's laser cannons powered up with a rising whine I felt through the control yoke. The targeting computer initialized with a soft chime that sounded absurdly pleasant given what it meant. The sensor display resolving to a tactical picture that showed our squadron's position relative to the Contactic Ultra. The frigate-sized, moving slowly, probably to Korean. Gold Squadron, attack pattern Theta 2. Target the Corvette's engines and shield generators. Fire on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark while. We broke formation. Hang? 6 TIE fighter saw. Gold 8. Hadn't launched yet. Some technical issue that would probably result in that pilot being reassigned to sanitation detail. Accelerating toward the Corvette at velocities that made the moon seem to rush toward us, rather than us rushing toward it. The targeting computer was already calculating intercept courses, showing me the optimal firing solution, the exact moment when I'd need to trigger my lasers to account for the light speed delay, and the target's evasive maneuvers, and the 1,000 other variables that separated a successful hit from wasted energy dissipating into vacuum. The Corvette saw us. Of course it saw us. It would have been scanning the area before it emerged from cover, would have known the Star Destroyer was here, would have known that attacking or even remaining in the area was suicide. But it didn't jump to hyperspace. It didn't turn and run. Instead, it did something that made my stomach clench with a fear I didn't fully understand yet. It launched fighters. 4 of them. Small, fast, X-wing fighters dropping from the Corvette's ventral hangar bay and immediately spreading into an attack formation that was depressingly competent. Rebel pilots. Not the untrained militia we've been told to expect. Not desperate civilians in stolen ships, but actual military pilots flying ships that had shields and hyperdrives and armament packages that could shred a TIE fighter if they got a clean shot. Break by pairs, Gold Leader ordered, his comm starting to sound strained. Gold 1 and 2, stay on the Corvette. 3 and 4, engage the X-Wings. 5 and 6, Cover them. 7. On me. We're taking the far pair. On him. I was flying with Gold Leader, which meant either he trusted me, or he was planning to use me as a distraction while he made the actual kill shots. Probably the second one. Definitely the second one. But I confirmed the order. Gold 7 copies, and pushed my throttle to maximum. Feeling the ion engine surge. Feeling the acceleration press me back into the seat. Feeling my breathing accelerate to match my heart rate until the cockpit was filled with the sound of my own panic, processed through speakers, and fed back to me as mechanical certainty. The distance closed fast. Too fast. The X-Wings were coming straight at us, not evading, not braking, just screaming toward us at combat speed with their S-foils locked in attack position, and their laser cannons already cycling through pre-fire, warm-up sequences I could see as faint glows on my sensor display. This was wrong. This was tactically insane. X-Wing pilots were supposed to be cautious, supposed to use their shields and their superior durability to outlast TIE fighters in protracted engagements, not charge directly into a head-on pass where everyone would get exactly one chance to kill everyone else before they interpenetrated and had to loop back for another run. Unless they didn't plan to loop back. Unless they were planning to break. Gold Leader's scream. The calm completely gone now, replaced by pure survival instinct. Break now. I yanked the control yoke sideways, throwing the TIE fighter into a roll so violent that my vision grayed and my inner ear tried to convince me that down was actually sideways, and I was about to crash into a moon that wasn't anywhere near me. The X-Wing that had been targeting me flashed past, close enough that I could see the individual panel lines on its hull, close enough that I could see the pilot inside the canopy, close enough that for a fraction of a second we made eye contact. This person who was trying to kill me and who I was trying to kill. This person who was trying to kill me and who I was trying to kill. This person who probably had a name and a history, and people who would... One of us was still alive. Gold 4 wasn't. His fighter simply ceased to exist, replaced by an expanding sphere of gas and debris that had been a person and a machine 3 seconds ago. The X-Wing that killed Hima, not the one that had passed me, a different one, I was already looping back, already lining up another attack run with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this before, who'd killed Imperial pilots before, who was going to keep killing Imperial pilots until someone killed them, or the war ended, or the universe collapsed into heat death. Gold 4 is down. Someone shouted unnecessarily through the comm. I can't, where did the, Gold Leader, I need a... The transmission cut off. Gold 6, probably. Or maybe Gold 5. Why? It was getting hard to track who was still alive, who was still transmitting, who was still capable of the kind of coordinated tactical action that Doctrine said was the only way to defeat numerically inferior, but qualitatively superior enemy forces. The X-Wings weren't numerically inferior anymore. We'd started with 6 fighters. We were down to 4, maybe 3. Hard to tell because my sensor display was cluttered with debris, and my attention was split between the X-Wing, trying to get behind me, and the Corvette in the distance that was now firing its turbolasers in our direction, adding another layer of lethality to a situation that was already well past the point where Doctrine said we should disengage and return to the relentless for reinforcement. But we couldn't disengage. I'm sure disengaging was retreat. Retreat without orders was cowardice. Cowardice was treason. And treason meant your family would receive notification that you died bravely in service of the Empire. Except they'd know the truth because the bounty on deserters was generous enough that someone always talked, always gave up the coordinates of wherever you'd tried to hide, always collected their credits while you were executed in some Star Destroyer's hangar bay, as an example to other pilots who might be contemplating the same choice. So, we fought. I fought. pulled the TIE fighter through maneuvers that made my G-suit squeeze my legs hard enough to leave bruises, that made my vision tunnel, that made my breathing sound like someone drowning in their own fear. The X-Wing was good. The pilot was better than me, had more experience, had a ship that could absorb punishment while mine would disintegrate if they got a single clean shot. My only advantages were speed and desperation. I used both. Dove toward the moon's surface, pulling the X-Wing into a pursuit curve that brought us skimming across ancient craters and abandoned mining equipment, close enough to the surface that my proximity alarms were screaming, and the X-Wing had to either back off or risk collision with the terrain. They backed off. Half a second of separation. Enough time for me to kill my forward thrust and fire my ventral thrusters, essentially stopping in mid or on mid-space pa, while the X-Wing shot past me, their momentum carrying them ahead, reversing our position so suddenly that their pilot didn't have time to react before I had them centered in my targeting reticle. I fired. Both cannons, full power, a stream of superheated plasma that crossed the distance in microseconds and caught the X-Wing on their port engine nacelle, punching through their shields because they diverted shield power to forward arc for the chase and hadn't expected me to be stupid enough or desperate enough or desperate enough or lucky enough to reverse the engagement geometry. The engine exploded. The X-Wing spun, tried to compensate with their remaining engine, failed, and crashed into the lunar surface at a shallow angle that turned them into a brief streak of fire, and then nothing. I'd killed someone, taken a life, ended whatever future that pilot might have had, and I felt nothing except relief that they were dead, and I wasn't, and disappointment that I'd wasted 3 seconds watching them crash when I should have been acquiring the next target, and fear that the nothing I felt was going to expand until it consumed everything I'd been before I joined the Empire, and turned me into exactly the kind of person who could sit in a cockpit and kill strangers and go back to their bunk and sleep without dream. Gold 7, good kill. Gold Leader's voice, still strained but functional. Reform on me. We're making another pass on the Corvette. 3 and 6 are down. It's just us and Gold 2 now. 3 of us. Out of 6. 50% casualties in an engagement that had lasted less than 4 minutes, and we were being ordered back in. Back toward the Corvette that was still firing. Back toward the remaining X-Wing saw. He counted 2 of them still active on my sensors, which meant we'd achieved kill parity, except their ships were better, and their pilots were probably better, and our only actual advantage was that we couldn't retreat without being charged with cowardice. I formed up on Gold Leader. Gold 2 joined us a moment later, their fighter trailing coolant vapor from a damaged heat exchanger, a wound that wasn't immediately fatal, but would become fatal if they pushed their systems too hard for too long. We accelerated toward the Corvette. The distance was wrong now. We'd been scattered across several cubic kilometers of space during the dogfight, and reforming meant we were approaching from a predictable vector, exactly the kind of approach that the Corvette's gunners would have pre-sighted, pre-calculated, pre-registered for maximum lethality. The turbolasers fired. Heavy weapons designed for ship-to-ship combat, vast overkill for starfighters, but effective nonetheless because when you fired enough destructive energy into a volume of space, probability eventually caught up with you. Gold 2 vanished. Not exploded. Not disabled. Simply erased, struck by a turbolaser bolt that contained more energy than a TIE fighter's entire mass could absorb, converted from matter to high-energy particles in a reaction so complete that there wasn't even debris left behind. Just a fading glow that might have been my imagination. Continue attack run, Gold Leader said, his voice hollow now, the voice of a man who'd just watched his squadron die and was still being asked to complete the mission because the mission was all that mattered. Target the shield generator. On my marka. One of the remaining X-Wings got him. A perfect deflection shot, leading his position by exactly the right amount, catching him as he tried to juke, punching through his cockpit in a burst of lasers that probably killed him instantly, which was the best anyone could hope for. His TIE fighter continued forward for a few seconds, momentum carrying it onward, before it began a slow tumble that would eventually bring it into contact with the moon, or the Corvette, or the infinite nothing of space. I was alone. Last survivor of Gold Squadron. Flying a damaged TIE fighter on. Something was wrong with my port maneuvering thruster, giving every turn a sluggish delay that could mean death the next time I needed to evade toward a Corvette. And 2 X-Wings that had just killed 5 Imperial pilots, and would kill me too, if I didn't do something unpredictable, or brilliant, or suicidally stupid. I pulled up. Hard vertical climb relative to the lunar surface, maximum thrust, every system pushed to redline as I tried to gain altitude and separation, and any kind of tactical advantage that might let me survive the next 30 seconds. The X-Wings followed. Of course, they followed. I was alone and damaged, and the only remaining threat to their Corvette, and eliminating me would let them complete whatever mission had brought them here. I could see them on my sensors, climbing after me, matching my acceleration, slowly closing the distance because their ships were designed for space superiority, and mine was designed to be cheap enough to field in overwhelming numbers. My life support indicator was flashing amber. 17 minutes of oxygen remaining. I'd been breathing too hard, burning through my air supply at twice the rated consumption, and now I was going to run out of breathable atmosphere before I ran out of reactor fuel. Another lesson they hadn't emphasized in training. You could have unlimited engine power and still die because your body needed things that engines didn't. The comm crackled. Not Imperial frequency. Nolan Cassid Mansolisharto. Rebel frequency. Someone had hacked into my receiver, which should have been impossible except apparently wasn't. A woman's voice, filtered and processed, but still recognizably human. Imperial pilot. Dashi. You're alone. Your squadron is gone. Your ship is damaged. You have maybe 15 minutes of air left. Disengage. Wah. Surrender. Surrender. We'll take you prisoner. You'll live. I could see them now without sensors. 2 X-Wings climbing in perfect formation, close enough that I could make out the individual details of their ships. The scoring on their hulls from previous battles, the kill markers painted on their fuselages, Lanike's marks on one, 9 on the other. 15 dead Imperial pilots between them. And they wanted to make it 16, except they were offering me the option to be 16 alive instead of 16. Your empire doesn't care about you, the voice continued. You're a resource to them, a number on a spreadsheet. They'll replace you before your body's cold, but you can choose differently. You can choose to live. My hand was on the comm control. I could respond, could negotiate, could ask what terms they were offering, what kind of life I might have as a prisoner of the rebellion, whether there was any possibility of exchange or ransom, or simply being warehoused somewhere until the war ended one way or another. I could choose to live. All I had to do was surrender. Admit defeat. Break my oath to the Empire. Betray everything I'd been taught and trained to believe. Become the kind of person who valued their own survival over duty. I thought about my family on Coruscant. Hanmi, my mother, who'd been so proud when I was accepted to the academy. My father, who'd served 30 years in the Imperial Army and retired with commendations and a pension, and the satisfaction of knowing he'd helped build order from chaos. My younger sister, who wrote me letters every month carefully worded to pass Imperial censors, telling me about her studies and her friends, and her hope that I'd come home safe. What would they receive if I surrendered? A notification that I'd been captured? Or a notification that I'd died bravely in combat? A fiction maintained to spare them the shame of having a coward in the family. The Empire would call it cowardice. The rebellion would call it sanity. Both would be right. Both would be wrong. The truth was, I was 19 years old and terrified and exhausted, and so far past the point of rational decision-making that any choice I made would be arbitrary, dictated more by muscle memory and institutional conditioning than by any kind of genuine free will. I didn't respond to the rebel pilot. Instead, I rolled my TIE fighter inverted and dove, straight down toward the moon's surface, building speed, accepting the inevitable. If I was going to die, and I was going to die. That had been certain from the moment I sealed myself into this cockpit for the first time. Then, I was going to die in a way that matched the propaganda. Fast, not aggressive, uncompromising, a servant of the Empire until the last moment. Because the alternative was living with the knowledge that I'd betrayed everything I'd been taught to believe in, and I wasn't sure which would be worse, dying as a loyal Imperial pilot or living as a traitor to that loyalty. The X-Wings followed me down. They were saying something over the comm, the woman's voice more urgent now, probably trying to warn me that I was approaching terrain at a velocity that would kill me, that I needed to pull up, that whatever I was planning wasn't worth it. But I wasn't planning anything. I was just falling, and letting gravity and velocity make the decision for me. Whoa, right. Watching the lunar surface grow larger in my viewport, ancient craters and abandoned structures, all of it gray and lifeless and expanding to fill my entire field of vision. At the last possible second, I pulled up. Not because I'd changed my mind, not because I wanted to live, but because the training was hardwired so deep that my hands moved before my brain could override them, yanking the control yoke back, firing the ventral thrusters, pulling out of the dive with a maneuver so violent that my vision went completely black for a moment, as my blood pressure dropped and my G-suit squeezed my legs, and my body tried to shut down rather than process the physics of what I was experiencing. When my vision cleared, I was skimming across the lunar surface at an altitude measured in meters rather than kilometers, and one of the X-Wings had crashed. They'd followed me down, matched my dive, but either their reflexes weren't as good or their nerve broke a fraction of a second too late, and they'd impacted at something close to orbital velocity. The debris field stretched out behind me, already cooling, already becoming just another scatter of wreckage on a moon that had probably seen 1,000 crashes over the centuries it had been used as an Imperial patrol zone. 14 dead Imperial pilots. 1 dead rebel pilot. The arithmetic of warfare. The remaining X-Wing broke off. I saw them climb away on my sensors, heading back toward their Corvette, abandoning the engagement, either because they decided I wasn't worth the additional risk, or because they'd achieved their primary objective and killing one more Imperial pilot wasn't tactically necessary. The Corvette was already moving, already orienting toward a hyperspace jump vector, already planning to be gone before the Star Destroyer decided to close range and finish what we'd started. I could have pursued, should have pursued. My orders had been to destroy the Corvette, and orders didn't become void just because your squadron was dead and you were damaged and running low on oxygen. But pursuing meant dying. The X-Wing would kill me, or the Corvette's turbolasers would kill me, or I'd run out of breathable air while still in combat and suffocate inside my helmet, while enemy fighters circled, waiting for my fighter to go ballistic before they left the system. I returned to the relentless instead, limped back across the distance on minimal thrust, trying to conserve what little oxygen I had left, trying to keep my breathing shallow and measured while my body screamed for more air, and my vision started to sparkle at the edges with the pre-syncope patterns that meant I was approaching hypoxia. The Star Destroyer grew slowly larger in my viewport. Too slowly. I ran the numbers in my head distance, velocity, oxygen remaining, breathing rate, and the arithmetic told me I wasn't going to make it. I'd suffocate approximately 6 minutes before I reached the hangar bay, would die so close to safety that they'd be able to recover my body with barely any inconvenience. But the Relentless launched a recovery shuttle, a Lambda-class transport with a pressurized passenger compartment and medical equipment, and a crew that had done this before, had collected dying pilots before, had watched young men and women gasp and convulse as their oxygen ran out while the shuttle flew as fast as safely possible toward the hangar bay. They caught up to me with 3 minutes of oxygen remaining. Used a tractor beam to grab my TIE fighter and pull it into their ventral docking bay. pressurized the compartment, opened my canopy manually because I no longer had the strength to work the emergency release. I remember the medic's face. A woman, older, with gray at her temples and eyes that had seen too many pilots, in exactly my condition. She didn't speak, just pulled my helmet off and pressed an oxygen mask to my face and held it there while I breathed and coughed and breathed again, while my body remembered how to process air that wasn't recycled and stale and tainted with the smell of my own fear. "You're Gold 7?" she asked finally, when my breathing had stabilized enough that I could probably respond. I nodded. "You're the only one?" I nodded again. She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to her assistant and said something I couldn't hear, and they began running diagnostic scans with handheld equipment, checking me for injuries I hadn't noticed, for damage I'd been too focused on survival to register. I'd been in combat for 12 minutes. 12 minutes from the moment we detected the Corvette to the moment the recovery shuttle had pulled me out of my dying fighter. 12 minutes that had killed 5 Imperial pilots and reduced Gold Squadron to a single survivor who was currently sitting in a rescue shuttle, trying not to think about the fact that he'd failed his first real mission, failed to protect his squadron leader, failed to destroy the enemy vessel, failed at everything except the bare minimum requirement of continuing to exist. The shuttle docked with the Relentless. The medic helped me stand up. Mealy legs weren't working properly yet. Some combination of muscle fatigue and the lingering G-force effects and shaka, and guided me through the corridors toward Medical Bay. We passed other pilots, other crew, all of them moving with purpose, all of them engaged in the endless work of keeping a Star Destroyer operational. None of them looked at me. Or maybe they did, and I just couldn't process it through the exhaustion and the ringing in my ears and the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking, no matter how tightly I clenched them. Medical Bay smelled like Bacta and disinfectant, and something else I couldn't identify. Something chemical and vaguely sweet that I would later learn was the smell of synthesized blood being processed for transfusion. They put me on a diagnostic bed, ran more scans. A doctor, young, efficient, already moving on to the next patient in his mind before he'd finished examining me, told me I had minor decompression injuries. Nothing serious, that my lungs showed signs of oxygen deprivation but would recover, that I was cleared to return to duty pending a psychological evaluation. "How long?" I asked. My voice sounded wrong. Way. Like I'd been screaming, though I couldn't remember screaming. 48 hours, he said. Standard protocol after combat losses. You'll meet with a counselor, answer some questions, sign some forms confirming you're fit for continued service. Then you'll be reassigned. Reassigned to what? He looked at me like I'd asked a stupid question. To a squadron, obviously. We have new TIE fighters arriving from the factory ships every day. Pilots are the limiting factor, not equipment. You'll be flying again within 72 hours. Run loud. He left. The medic who'd rescued me stayed long enough to adjust my EVA. They were hydrating me, replenishing electrolytes, doing something with medications I didn't recognize them. Then she left too. I was alone in a medical bay surrounded by other patients, other pilots and crew members who'd been injured in various ways. None of them acknowledging each other because acknowledging someone else's suffering meant acknowledging your own, and that was a path that led nowhere useful. I closed my eyes. Tried to sleep? No. Couldn't. Every time I approached unconsciousness, I'd see Gold Leader's TIE fighter tumbling through space, or Gold 4's explosion, or the X-Wing pilot I'd killed crashing into the lunar surface, and my breathing would accelerate, and I'd jerk awake with my heart pounding, and the medical equipment chirping alarms until a nurse came over to reset it and remind me that I needed to rest. Rest. As if rest was something you could do after watching your entire squadron die. As if your mind could simply process 5 violent deaths and 1 narrow survival and file them away neatly under completed missions. and move on to whatever came next. But that's what they expected. That's what the psychological evaluation would determine, whether I could process trauma quickly enough to be useful, or whether I'd need to be transferred to some other duty, where my inability to forget wouldn't compromise operational efficiency. The Empire needed pilots who could kill and watch their friends die, and then climb back into a cockpit the next day, and do it again. Pilots who could compartmentalize, who could function despite everything, who could turn horror into routine through sheer repetition until the horror stopped registering as horror and became just another part of the job. I stayed in medical bay for 6 hours. Then they discharged me with a printout of my injuries and medications and instructions to report to psychology division at 0800 the next morning. Someone gave me directions to my new quartersaw. My old quarters had been in the junior pilot dormitory, but as the sole survivor of Gold Squadron, I'd apparently been upgraded to slightly less crowded accommodations, a cabin I'd share with only 3 other pilots instead of 11. A reward for survival, or a way to keep me separated from the bulk of the pilot corps, until they determined whether my survival was legitimate, or whether I'd done something cowardly that had kept me alive while my squadron mates died. I found the cabin. 3 bunks, 3 lockers, 3 men who looked up when I entered, and then looked away just as quickly when they saw my flight suit and the empty name tape on my chest, where my squadron patch should have been. They didn't introduce themselves. I didn't ask. We existed in the same small space, but we weren't colleagues yet, weren't friends, wouldn't be anything except people who slept in proximity, until the Navy decided what to do with us. I lay on my assigned bunker, the one nearest the door, the one nobody else wanted because it had the worst ventilation, and you'd be the first person guards would see if they came looking for someone, and stared at the ceiling, and listened to the omnipresent hum of the Star Destroyer's systems. That hum, that low-frequency vibration that permeated everything, that you could feel through the deck plates and the walls and your own bones. The sound of a ship so massive that it generated its own gravity and carried 12,000 people and hundreds of starfighters and enough firepower to reduce a planet's surface to molten slag. The sound of the Empire. The sound of order. The sound that would be with me every moment of every day until I died or was transferred or somehow found a way to exist outside the machine that had swallowed me. I didn't sleep that night. Just lay there, listening to the hum, listening to my own breathing, remembering how it had sounded in the cockpit, amplified and mechanical and desperate. One of my cabin mates snored. Another muttered in his sleep. Words I couldn't make out, but which sounded like pleading. The third one I realized eventually wasn't sleeping either. I could hear him shifting position every few minutes, could sense his wakefulness in the darkness, could feel the shared understanding that sleep wasn't going to come easy for any of us, that whatever dreams we might have would be worse than lying awake and remembering. 0800 came eventually. I reported to Psychology Division, a section of the Star Destroyer I'd never visited before, located deep in the interior, where there were no viewports and the walls were painted a neutral beige that was probably chosen because it was statistically the least objectionable color to the most people. A clerka, young woman with the kind of perfect posture that suggested she'd been trained at the same academy I had, but had washed out of flight training and been reassigned to administrative duty, took my information and told me to wait. I waited. 30 minutes. Down to an hour. The only to take around. Other pilots came and went, called into offices by counselors whose job was to determine whether we were still useful or whether our psychological damage had crossed some threshold that made us liabilities. I wondered what that threshold was. How much trauma you could accumulate before the Empire decided you weren't worth the continued investment. How many dead friends? How many close calls? How many times you could watch someone die before you started to identify with them, more than with the machine that had ordered their death? Pilot 7? A man's voice. Older. Ringy. Nunsham Nasiubun. Wrong, sir. Elder. Tired. The counselor. I stood, followed him into a small office that contained a desk, 2 chairs, and nothing else except a data terminal and a shelf of regulation manuals that probably hadn't been opened in years. He gestured for me to sit. I sat. He reviewed something on his terminal, his expression neutral, his body language giving away nothing about what he was thinking, or what he'd already decided about my fitness for duty. "I've reviewed your mission logs," he said, "and your flight recorder data, and the after-action reports from the other ships in the task force. You're aware that Gold Squadron suffered 100% casualties, except for yourself?" "Yes, sir." "Can you describe your tactical thinking during the engagement?" "Could I describe it?" "No." "Could I put into words the animal panic and the training fighting for control, and the decisions that weren't really decisions at all but just reactions to stimuli? The kind of responses that happen faster than conscious thought because conscious thought takes too long and gets you killed?" I tried. Walked him through the engagement in clinical language, using the terminology they'd taught us at the academy, reducing the horror to tactical abstractions. Target acquired at 0943. Gold Squadron initiated. Attack pattern, Beta Tutorial. Enemy fighters were deployed from the Corvette. We engaged. I achieved 1 confirmed kill through reversal maneuver. Squadron casualties occurred through superior enemy tactics and firepower. I returned to base when continuation of the mission ceased to be tactically viable. No, he made notes. "You, sir?" Asked follow-up questions. Wanted to know why I'd broken off the attack on the Corvette. Why I'd returned to the Relentless instead of pursuing. Why I'd survived when pilots with more experience and better tactical judgment had died. That last question, Didn't phrase it that way, but that's what he was asking. Why are you alive? What did you do differently? What did you do wrong? Because in the Empire's arithmetic, survival wasn't always evidence of skill. Sometimes it was evidence of cowardice. Sometimes the pilots who came home were the ones who'd hung back, who'd let their squadron mates absorb the enemy fire, who'd prioritize their own survival over the mission objectives. I followed orders, I said. I engaged when ordered. I broke off when continuation would have resulted in mission failure with no tactical gain. You broke off when you were the only pilot remaining, he corrected. At that point, weren't you the squadron commander? Didn't you have the authority and the responsibility to continue the attack regardless of personal risk? He was right. Technically, when Gold Leader died, command should have passed to Gold 2. And when Gold 2 died, it should have passed to whoever was next in the chain, which would have been me or Gold 6. And since Gold 6 was also dead, that meant I'd been the acting commander for the last few minutes of the engagement, which meant every decision I'd made after that point was a command decision. Which meant my choice to return to base instead of pressing the attack could be interpreted as abandoning the mission, which was grounds for court-martial, which was grounds for execution. I made a tactical assessment, I said carefully. 1 damaged TIE fighter against a Corvette and remaining enemy fighters. Probability of mission success was effectively 0. Probability of mission success if I returned to base and reported enemy position for follow-up strike? Non-zero. I chose the option with the higher probability of ultimate mission success. It was a good answer. The kind of answer that demonstrated tactical thinking and mission focus, and the ability to make decisions under pressure. It was also complete bullshit. I'd returned to base because I was terrified and oxygen deprived, and wanted desperately to live. And the tactical justification had occurred to me later, in medical bay, while I was lying there trying to figure out how to explain my survival in a way that wouldn't get me charged with cowardice. The counselor studied me. 1. His expression hadn't changed. He was good at DSA, reading people, detecting lies, finding the cracks in a pilot's psychological armor that indicated they were becoming unreliable. But he was also processing dozens of pilots every day. All of them traumatized in various ways, all of them trying to say the right things and hide the wrong things and prove they were still useful to an empire that would discard them the moment they stopped being useful. Your assessment is noted, he said finally. I'm clearing you for return to flight status. You'll be assigned to a new squadron once one becomes available. In the meantime, you're on standby status. Report to the ready room at 0600 each day and wait for assignment. Is that clear? Yes, sir. June. Dismissed. I stood, left the office, walked back through the corridors of the Relentless with a medical clearance and a psychological clearance and the understanding that I'd been judged and found adequately functional, fit to climb back into a TIE fighter, fit to kill more people, fit to watch more squadron mates die, fit to continue serving the Empire until the day I stopped being fit, at which point I'd be replaced just like Gold Leader had been replaced, just like Gold 2 through 6 had been replaced, just like the previous Gold 7 Act. One whose cockpit I'd inherited, whose death had created the vacancy that I had filled, had been replaced by me. The ready room was exactly what it sounded like, a large compartment filled with uncomfortable chairs and data terminals and vending machines that dispensed ration bars and stimulants. This is where pilots waited between missions. Some of them studied tactical manuals. Some slept. Most just sat there, staring at nothing, conserving energy for the moment when they'd be called to the hangar bay and ordered to launch. I found an empty chair, sat down, tried not to look at the other pilots, tried not to wonder which of them would be in my next squadron, which of them I'd watch die, which of them would watch me die. A woman sitting near me glanced over. She was younger, maybe my age, maybe younger, with the kind of face that looked like it had been designed for propaganda posters. Symmetrical, confident, idealistic. She still believed. You could see it in her eyes, the conviction that serving the Empire was noble, and that her death would mean something if it came. You're new? She asked. Yes. What happened to your last squadron? Everyone always wanted to know what happened to your last squadron. It was the first question pilots asked each other, the way other people might ask about family or home planet. Your squadron was your identity. Your squadron's reputation was your reputation. Your squadron's survival rate was your survival rate. Dead, I said. All of them. First mission? Her expression shifted. Not quite sympathy, Sympathy was a luxury you couldn't afford in the Imperial Navy, but a kind of recognition. An understanding that I'd already experienced what she was still anticipating. That I'd crossed a threshold she hadn't crossed yet. I'm sorry, she said, and then immediately looked embarrassed, because saying sorry was admitting weakness, was admitting that deaths mattered, was admitting that we were anything other than perfectly efficient instruments of Imperial will. Don't be, I said. It's the job. She nodded, turned back to her data terminal. We didn't speak again, but I noticed that she left the ready room 20 minutes later, probably to find somewhere else to wait where she wouldn't have to sit next to someone who'd already lost a squadron. Someone who represented the future she was trying not to think about. I spent 3 days in the ready room. 72 hours of waiting, interrupted by meals and sleep, and the daily medical checks that ensured I wasn't developing any delayed complications from my oxygen deprivation. Other pilots came and went. Some were called to missions. Some didn't come back. You could always tell when a mission had gone badly on it. The pilots who did return would file into the ready room with that specific kind of silence that meant people had died. And then someone from personnel would show up with a data pad and start quietly removing names from the duty roster. On the 4th day, I was assigned to Blue Squadron, not Gold. That designation had been retired after our complete loss, a small gesture of respect for the dead that meant nothing, except that future pilots wouldn't have to inherit the psychological weight of a squadron name associated with total annihilation. Blue Squadron had 8 pilots. 7 now, with me filling the empty slot. Blue, 7. Again. Always 7. The junior slot, the expendable slot, The position that had the highest turnover because it was the position that absorbed the most risk during complex maneuvers. I met them in the hangar bay. Blue leader was a career pilot named Jenner, a man in his late 30s who'd somehow survived long enough to accumulate actual gray hair and a collection of small scars that suggested he'd been shot down at least once and lived through it. The others were younger, ranging from early 20s to mid-20s, all of them with the same expression I'd seen on my own face in medical bay, a careful blankness that hid whatever fear or doubt or despair they actually felt. "You're the survivor," Jenner said. Not a question, a statement. Everyone knew about Gold Squadron's loss. It was the kind of disaster that got discussed in ready rooms, an officers' mess, and probably in some Imperial Navy committee meeting, where senior officers debated whether the tactical doctrine that had killed my entire squadron needed to be revised, or whether it was simply bad luck combined with inferior pilot quality. Yes, sir. Good. That means you've already learned the most important lesson. TIE fighters are disposable. Pilots are disposable. The mission is not disposable. Everything else is just details. He paused, studied me, seemed to be deciding something. "You'll fly on my wing until I determine you're competent enough to fly independently. Don't make me regret taking you on. Understood?" "Yes, sir." He nodded, dismissed me with a gesture, and I was officially part of Blue Squadron. Part of a unit again. Oh, part of a formation that would fly together and fight together and probably die together. Except statistically, one or two of us would survive each engagement and carry forward the squadron's designation until we accumulated enough casualties to be disbanded or reformed or simply absorbed into other units as the Navy's endless reshuffling of personnel tried to maintain combat effectiveness, despite the steady attrition of rebellion and incommunicable reality. We flew our first mission together the next day. A patrol sweep through an asteroid field where intelligence suspected rebel supply runners were operating. It was a nothing mission. The kind of routine patrol that would either be completely uneventful or would turn into a sudden firefight with no warning and no time to prepare. We launched in formation, 8 TIE fighters streaming out of the Relentless's hangar bay like insects leaving a hive, and I was back in the cockpit again, back in the narrow space with my own breathing, amplified and mechanical, back in the place where I'd almost died, and would probably die eventually if I stayed in this career long enough. But the fear was different this time. Duller. More manageable. Not because I was braver, but because I'd already experienced the worst-case scenario and survived it. And now my brain had recalibrated its threat assessment. The first time in a cockpit, everything felt lethal. The second time, you had experience to compare against. You knew what actual combat felt like. You knew the difference between imagined danger and real danger. You knew that most patrols were boring, and most contacts were false alarms, and most missions ended with you landing safely and going back to your bunk and waiting for the next one. Most missions. Not all missions. Never all missions. The asteroid field was exactly as advertised. A chaotic cluster of rocks ranging from pebble-sized to kilometer-wide, all of them tumbling through space in trajectories that required constant attention and careful maneuvering to avoid collision. Our sensors were degraded by the high metallic content of the asteroids, which meant visual scanning and close-range patrols, and the constant possibility that something was hiding in the sensor shadows, waiting for us to fly past before emerging to attack our Star Destroyer or the convoy it was protecting. Blue Squadron, spread out to search Pattern Gamma, Jenner ordered. Maintain calm discipline. Report any contacts immediately. Stay sharp. We spread out. I took my position on Jenner's wing, matching his movements, following him through the asteroids with a precision that was partly training and partly fear of disappointing him, and being sent back to standby status where I'd have to wait for yet another squadron assignment. The asteroids drifted past my viewport, gray and brown, and occasionally streaked with metallic ores that caught the distant sunlight and created brief flashes of color in the otherwise monochrome landscape. It was almost beautiful, almost peaceful. The kind of environment that might be pleasant if you were here by choice rather than by orders, if you were exploring rather than hunting. if you were looking at the universe with wonder rather than watching for threats. Contact, someone said. Blue 3, I thought. Single ship, bearing 090 Mark 33. Looks like a freighter. Yaitiris, maybe modified. No transponder broadcast. No. Blue Squadron, converge on Blue 3's position, Jenner said. Weapons hot, but do not fire unless fired upon. We're here to interdict smugglers, not start diplomatic incidents. We converged. The freighter was exactly where Blue 3 had reported, ETA, battered, ETA 1300, the kind of ship that could be legitimate cargo hauler, or rebel transport depending on who was flying it, and what they were carrying. It was running dark, no lights, no transponder, engines at minimal power as it tried to drift through the asteroid field without being detected, which would have worked if we hadn't been doing a detailed search pattern. Which meant whoever was flying it had either gotten unlucky, or was inexperienced enough to think they could hide from Imperial patrols, using tactics that might have worked 5 years ago, but didn't work now. Unknown freighter, this is Blue Leader of the Imperial Navy. Jenner transmitted on standard hailing frequencies. You are in violation of Imperial space traffic regulations. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded for inspection. Failure to comply will result in your destruction. The freighter didn't respond. Didn't power down. Well, instead it did something stupid. It tried to run, firing up its engines and making a break for open space, accelerating directly away from us at a velocity that suggested someone had done significant modifications to its power plant. A legitimate cargo hauler would have stopped. A smart smuggler would have stopped and tried to bribe the inspection crew. An idiot or a rebel would run, gambling that they could reach hyperspace before we caught them. All Blue Squadron elements pursuit course, Jenner ordered. Disable the engines if possible. Destroy if necessary. Wide. Move. There'll be an error. We moved. Why? 8 TIE fighters accelerating after one freighter, cutting off its escape routes, herding it away from the clear space where it might have been able to jump. The freighter was faster than it should have been, but it wasn't fighter fast. We caught up within minutes, spreading out to surround it, establishing firing solutions on its engines and life support, and any system that might keep it mobile. Final warning, Jenner transmitted. Power down immediately or we will fire. The freighter's response was to open up with its dorsal turret, an antiquated quad-laser turret that would have been cutting-edge technology maybe 30 years ago, but was now just a liability that added mass and reduced the ship's acceleration. The shots went wide, nowhere close to hitting any of us. Either the gunner was incompetent or they were trying to scare us off rather than actually fight, sending a message that they were armed and willing to defend themselves, even though defending themselves against 8 Imperial starfighters was mathematically impossible. Blue Squadron, disable that ship, Jenner said, his voice calm, almost bored. Precision fire only. I want prisoners if possible. We fired. Coordinated shots from multiple angles, targeting the freighter's engines with the kind of accuracy that came from thousands of hours of practice. The engines exploded. A catastrophic explosion that would vaporize the ship, but a controlled destruction that left the hull intact while eliminating the freighter's ability to move under its own power. It tumbled, carried forward by momentum, but no longer under anyone's control, spinning slowly as its emergency systems tried and failed to compensate for the loss of primary propulsion. Blue 3 and 4 maintain position and monitor the freighter, Jenner ordered. Everyone else, resume patrol pattern. A recovery team will be here within the hour. We resumed patrol. The freighter drifted, disabled and helpless, while somewhere on that ship people were probably discussing their options and realizing they didn't have any. They'd be taken prisoner, interrogated, 1 or 2, charged with smuggling or rebellion, or whatever crimes the Navy determined were appropriate, sentenced to prison, or forced labor or execution, depending on what they'd been smuggling. and whether they'd been actively helping the Rebel Alliance, or just trying to avoid Imperial customs fees. I tried not to think about them, tried to treat them the way the Empire treated them on, as abstractions, as problem solved, as numbers in a report that would be filed and forgotten. But I kept imagining what it felt like to be in that disabled ship, tumbling through space, knowing that Imperial troops were coming to arrest you, knowing that your attempt to evade detection had failed, and that everything you'd risked to transport whatever you'd been transporting was now worthless because you'd been caught. They were probably terrified, probably arguing, probably desperate enough to consider jettisoning whatever illegal cargo they'd been carrying, as if getting rid of the evidence would save them from punishment. It wouldn't. The Navy had scanners, had forensic technicians, had interrogation specialists whose job was to extract information from people who didn't want to share it. Whatever secrets that freighter held would be exposed within hours of it being towed to the Star Destroyer's hangar bay. "Good work, Blue Squadron," Jenner said, after we'd completed another circuit of the asteroid field without finding additional contacts. "Clean intercept. No casualties. Exactly how these operations should go. 7, you did adequate work. Stay alert. We're not done yet." Adequate, the highest praise I'd received since joining the Imperial Navy. I'd done my job competently enough that the squadron leader acknowledged my existence. It felt like nothing. It felt like everything. It felt like proof that I was becoming the kind of pilot the Empire needed, someone who could follow orders and shoot accurately, and not ask questions about who we were shooting at or why. We returned to the Relentless 3 hours later, after completing our patrol sweep and confirming that the asteroid field contained nothing except one disabled freighter and thousands of rocks that would remain exactly where they were, slowly orbiting the system's star, until something moved them, or the star went supernova, or the heat death of the universe. The hangar bay was busy when we landed. Normal operations, fighters being refueled and rearmed, maintenance crews swarming over TIE fighters with diagnostic equipment and hydrospanners, deck officers shouting instructions over the constant noise of machinery and engines, and the omnipresent hum that defined life aboard a Star Destroyer. I sealed my canopy, ran through the post-flight checklist, waited for the deck crew to connect the external power and give me clearance to disembark. The same thin man with the scar across his throat was there, moving with the same efficient silence, checking systems, and making notes on a datapad that probably contained a complete maintenance history of every fighter in the bay. I climbed out. My legs were stiff from hours in the cockpit, my back ached from the ejection harness, and I could still hear my own breathing echoing in my head, even though I'd removed my helmet. That sound would follow me everywhere now, I realized. Would become the soundtrack to my life. The mechanical rhythm of my own survival played on repeat, a constant reminder that I was still breathing and others weren't. Blue Squadron debriefed in a conference room near the hangar. Jenner walked us through the engagement, what we'd done right, what we could have done better, how the intercept could have been executed more efficiently. His critiques were clinical, impersonal, focused entirely on tactical performance, rather than the human reality of what we'd just done. We'd disabled a ship. We'd ended someone's freedom. We'd probably condemned them to years in an Imperial prison or worse. And we were discussing it the way you might discuss a training exercise, evaluating our performance against doctrine, identifying areas for improvement. "Dismissed," Jenner said finally. "Next briefing is at 0600 tomorrow. Get rest. We have another patrol scheduled for the afternoon shift." Another patrol. Another mission. Another day of flying through space looking for people to kill or capture or intimidate into compliance. This was my life now. This was my career. This was what I'd chosen when I'd applied to the academy, though I hadn't understood then what it actually meant. Hadn't understood that serving the Empire wasn't about honor or glory or defending galactic civilization. It was about the salt routine enforcement of routine regulations, through routine violence, day after day, mission after mission, until eventually something killed you, or you accumulated enough service years to retire to some quiet world where
you spend the rest of your life trying to forget.
I went to my quarters. My 3 cabin mates were there, 2 of them sleeping, 1 reading something on a datapad. We still hadn't spoken beyond minimal acknowledgements. We still weren't friends. We were just 4 people who slept in the same room, who shared the same fate, who were all slowly being ground down by a machine that didn't care about our names, or our hopes, or our desperate private belief that we might somehow be different from all the other pilots who died in identical cockpits for identical reasons. I lay on my bunk, stared at the ceiling, listened to the hum. My days became weeks. Weeks became months. Blue Squadron flew patrol after patrol, engagement after engagement. We intercepted smugglers and fought rebel scouts, and provided cover for Imperial convoys moving through contested space. We took casualties. Blue 5 died when his fighter suffered a catastrophic power coupling failure during a high G-turn, and exploded before he could even transmit a distress signal. Blue 3 was shot down during a dogfight with a wing interceptors, managing to eject but drifting in his emergency vac suit for 6 hours before a rescue shuttle could retrieve him. Hanai survived, but the cold exposure damaged his nervous system badly enough that he was medically discharged and replaced within 2 days. Blue 8 simply disappeared during a night patrol, his transponder going dark between one sensor sweep and the next. His fighter never found despite extensive search operations. We got replacements. New pilots with the same expressions I'd worn when I joined Gold Squadron. That mixture of fear and determination, and desperate hope that they'd be good enough, or lucky enough, or smart enough to survive longer than the people they were replacing. Some of them were. Most weren't. The arithmetic of warfare continued its inexorable calculations, adding new names to the casualty lists, subtracting experienced pilots from the duty roster, multiplying losses across thousands of squadrons serving aboard hundreds of star destroyers spread throughout the galaxy. I survived. Not through skill, though I was getting better, accumulating experience, learning the tricks that might buy you an extra few seconds in combat. Not through luck, though luck played its role, putting me in positions where rebel fire went past my cockpit rather than through it. I survived through a kind of numbness. A systematic suppression of everything that made survival feel meaningful. I stopped thinking of the people I killed as people. Right? Stopped thinking of my squadron mates as friends. Stopped thinking about the future beyond the next mission, and the mission after that. Reduced my existence to a series of immediate tactical problems that could be solved through training and doctrine and the mechanical application of violence. It worked. Wow. It kept me functional. It turned me into exactly the kind of pilot the Empire needed. Efficient, obedient, willing to climb back into the cockpit day after day, despite knowing that every mission brought me statistically closer to the mission where my luck would run out. I flew with Blue Squadron for 8 months. Then Blue Squadron was disbanded after we took 80% casualties during a single disastrous engagement with rebel corvettes near Bothawi, and I was reassigned to Red Squadron aboard a different star destroyer. Then Red Squadron, then Green, then Gold again. They'd recycled the designation, decided enough time had passed that the name no longer carried bad luck. Then back to Blue when Gold was wiped out in a rebel ambush. Then Yellow. Then White. 3 years. 37 months of continuous service. Duarni. Padialantao. True. 143 combat missions. 68 confirmed kills. 6 squadron reassignments. 2 medical evacuations for injuries that weren't serious enough to merit discharge. 1 commendation for tactical excellence after I'd managed to disable a rebel transport that turned out to be carrying stolen Imperial weapons. Countless hours in cockpits, Countless cycles of launch and combat and return, countless moments where I'd watched other pilots die and felt nothing except relief that it wasn't me. I was good now. Experienced. One of the senior pilots aboard the Star Destroyer Conquest, flying as White Leader with my own flight of junior pilots, who looked at me the way I'd once looked at Gold Leader, someone who'd survived long enough to accumulate knowledge and scars, and the kind of casual competence that comes from having done something so many times that it stops being terrifying and becomes merely routine. They didn't know that the competence was hollow, that the confidence was performance, that every time I sealed myself into a TIE fighter cockpit, I still heard my own breathing amplified and mechanical and desperate, still felt the walls closing in, still knew with absolute certainty that one day the math would catch up and I'd die exactly like Gold Leader had died, exactly like hundreds of other squadron leaders had died, exactly like I'd been statistically certain to die since the moment I'd first sat in a cockpit and realized what had fallen. But I kept flying, kept killing, kept surviving, because the alternative was admitting that I'd made a mistake. Admitting that everything I'd sacrificed on me youth, my humanity, my ability to feel anything except exhaustion and fear and a distant echo of the person I'd been before the Academia, had been wasted in service of an empire that would forget my name before my body cooled. And admitting that would mean confronting the reality that I'd spent 3 years becoming a monster who killed for a living and called it duty. The breaking point came during a mission that should have been routine. Intelligence reported a rebel cell operating from a mining station in the Outer Rim. Coordinates provided by an informant who'd probably been tortured, or bribed, or blackmailed into betraying people who trusted him. We were ordered to destroy the station, not disable it. Not capture the rebels for interrogation. Destroy it. Complete annihilation. Because the Empire had decided that mercy was expensive and terror was cheap. That executing 1,000 potential rebels was more efficient than sorting the guilty from the innocent. That total war was the only kind of war worth fighting when your enemy refused to recognize that they'd already lost. White Squadron launched with orders to suppress the station's defenses while the Star Destroyer moved into bombardment range. 8 TIE fighters against a mining station that had been retrofitted with defensive weapons. Nothing serious, light turbolasers and missile launchers, the kind of armament that might deter pirates, but wouldn't stop a determined Imperial assault. We engaged, destroyed the turrets, eliminated the missiles, made the station helpless, and then the Star Destroyer opened fire. I watched it happen. You? Watched the turbolaser strikes hit the station's reactors, watched the structure come apart in sections, watched atmosphere venting and debris spinning, and the brief flares that might have been escape pods or might have been the secondary explosions, or might have been people being ejected into vacuum without suits. The station's population was 3,000 civilians, according to the intelligence brief. Miners and their families. Support staff. Maybe 100 rebels hiding among them, using them as shields, making them complicit through proximity. The Empire killed them all, because that was simpler than trying to separate the guilty from the innocent. Because terror was the doctrine. Because making an example was more important than justice or mercy, or any of the principles the propaganda claimed we were defending. I had killed 3,000 people. Not directly, hadn't fired the shots that destroyed the station, but I'd been part of the operation, part of the machine that had made it possible. I'd disabled the defenses that might have given those people time to evacuate. I'd followed orders. I'd done my duty. And somewhere in the burning wreckage spinning slowly through space were bodies, fragments of lives, evidence that I had become exactly what the Empire had trained me to become. An instrument of mass murder who could watch atrocity and feel nothing except satisfaction that the mission had been completed successfully. That night I couldn't sleep. Couldn't silence the hum. Couldn't stop hearing my own breathing. That amplified mechanical rhythm that had become the soundtrack to years of killing. I lay in my bunk and stared at the ceiling, and tried to remember who I'd been before all this. Tried to recall the person who'd believed the propaganda and thought serving the Empire meant something noble. That person was gone. Had been gone for years. Had died gradually through thousands of small compromises and moral concessions, in moments where I'd chosen survival over conscience, until there was nothing left of me, except the parts that knew how to fly and shoot and follow orders. I could leave. Wah. The thought occurred to me suddenly, clearly, with an intensity that felt almost like hope. I could desert. Could steal a TIE fighter during my next patrol, and make a run for neutral space or rebel territory, or any of 1,000 worlds where the Empire's reach was weak enough that I might disappear. People had done it before. Not many desertion rates in the Imperial Navy were surprisingly low, a combination of indoctrination and fear, and the practical reality that TIE fighters had terrible range, and most pilots who tried to desert simply ran out of fuel before reaching safety. But some succeeded. Some escaped. Some found ways to exist outside the machine. Except I knew I wouldn't do it. Knew with absolute certainty that when morning came, I'd report to the briefing, accept my mission assignment, climb into my cockpit, and keep doing what I'd always done. Not because I believed in the Empire anymore. I couldn't remember if I'd ever actually believed, or if I just believed in the idea of believing. The comfort of having a purpose, even if that purpose was fundamentally hollow. Not because I was afraid of being caught. Death as a deserter didn't seem significantly worse than death as a pilot, and at least desertion would be a choice rather than just another casualty statistic. I wouldn't desert because deserting would require having somewhere to go, someone to be, some vision of a future that wasn't defined by the cockpit and the hum and the sound of my own desperate breathing. And I didn't have that. The Empire had taken it from me, or I'd given it away, or maybe I'd never had it at all. Either way, I was trapped. Not by bulkheads and atmospheric containment fields, but by the person I'd become. By the years of accumulated trauma and moral damage that had calcified into something that looked like purpose, but was really just inertia. So I kept flying. Years passed. I don't remember them clearly anymore. They blurred together into an endless series of missions and casualties and squadron reassignments, each one identical to the last except for the specific details of who died and how and whether I felt anything when it happened. I made it to 5 years of service. Then 6, then 7. Longer than most TIE fighter pilots survived. Long enough that I was considered a veteran, valuable, worth protecting during high-risk missions, because experienced pilots were becoming scarce as the rebellion grew, and Imperial recruitment standards dropped, and the quality of our equipment declined, and the tactical situation deteriorated across sectors that had once been secure. I was promoted, made squadron commander, given my own unit to lead and train, and watch die. I tried to keep them alive, tried to teach them the tricks I'd learned, tried to pass on the knowledge that might buy them a few extra missions. Most of them died anyway, not because they were incompetent, but because competence only mattered at the margins, and the margins were getting smaller as rebel pilots became better and rebel ships became more advanced, and the Empire's response was to build more TIE fighters that were cheaper and lighter and more disposable than ever. Then came Yavin. We weren't there. Me squadron was assigned to a different task force, patrolling a different sector, engaged in the same routine enforcement operations that had defined my entire career. But we heard about it. Everyone heard about it. The Death Star destroyed. The Emperor's ultimate weapon, the technological terror that was supposed to end the rebellion through sheer overwhelming force, reduced to debris by a handful of X-Wings and one impossibly lucky shot. The news spread through the fleet in hours, carried on unofficial channels and rumor networks, discussed in whispers in the ready rooms and the mess halls and the maintenance bays, where pilots and crew tried to process what it meant. It meant we were losing. That was the truth nobody wanted to acknowledge, but everyone understood. The Empire was still vast, still controlled most of the galaxy, still had resources and manpower and industrial capacity that dwarfed the rebellions. But momentum was shifting. Territory that had been secure was becoming contested. Sectors that had been loyal were becoming ambiguous. Planets that had accepted Imperial rule were starting to question whether the order the Empire promised was worth the price it demanded. And TIE fighter pilots kept dying, kept climbing into cockpits, kept launching on missions that mattered less and less because the strategic situation was deteriorating faster than tactical victories could compensate for. We were still winning individual engagements, still destroying rebel ships, BOSMD, still completing our assigned missions with acceptable casualty rates. But we were losing the war. Slowly. Incrementally. In ways that wouldn't be obvious until years from now when historians would look back and identify this moment as the turning point, the place where the Empire's inevitable victory became the Empire's probable defeat. I flew for 2 more years after Yavin. Watched the rebellion grow. Watched the Empire become more desperate, more brutal, more willing to commit atrocities in the name of order. Watched my squadron die, and get replaced and die again. An endless cycle of destruction that felt less like warfare, and more like sacrifice of young pilots, offered up to a doctrine that had stopped working, but which nobody with authority was willing to admit had stopped working. Then came Hoth. Another defeat disguised as victory. We'd destroyed the rebel base, scattered their forces, proven that the Empire could strike anywhere the rebels tried to hide. But they'd escaped. The important ones, the leadership, the people who actually mattered. We'd killed a base and let an army slip away. And in the process, we'd lost 3 star destroyers and thousands of pilots, and accomplished nothing except demonstrating that the rebellion could survive anything we threw at them. My squadron participated in the Hoth operation. Shadowy. Well done. We provided fighter cover during the ground assault, engaged rebel snowspeeders, patrolled the evacuation routes looking for fleeing transports. I watched pilots die in atmospheric combat, their fighters brought down by cable weapons and ion cannons, and surface-to-air fire from entrenched positions. I watched the rebels evacuate in good order despite our interdiction efforts. I watched the Empire declare victory while everyone who'd actually fought the battle understood we'd failed. I was 30 years old. I'd been flying TIE fighters for 11 years. I'd survived longer than any other pilot in my graduating class from the academy. Longer than 99% of all TIE fighter pilots. Long enough that I should have been transferred to training duties or staff positions, or any of the assignments that kept experienced pilots alive and useful, rather than risking them in combat operations that statistically would kill them eventually, no matter how good they were. But I kept flying. Not because I wanted to. Not because I believed in anything anymore. I kept flying because it was what I knew how to do, because stopping would require confronting everything I'd done and everything I'd become. Because the cockpit was the only place where the hum was loud enough to drown out thought. My last mission was 6 months after Hoth. Routine patrol in a system I don't remember the name of, looking for rebel scouts in an asteroid field that probably didn't contain rebels. My squadron launched 8 fighters. All of us veterans know why. The Empire had stopped sending inexperienced pilots to frontline squadrons because they died too quickly to justify the training investment. We flew our search pattern. We flew our search pattern. Found nothing. Started our return to the carrier. And then my life support failed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just a gradual degradation. A leak in the oxygen recycler that I didn't notice until my readout showed 20 minutes of air remaining, when it should have shown 40. Then 15. Then 10. I reported it. I requested emergency recovery. The carrier dispatched a shuttle. Same procedure that had saved me 11 years ago during my first combat mission. Except this time, the shuttle was delayed. Some technical issue, some problem with the docking mechanism, some minor malfunction that added 5 minutes to their response time. 5 minutes I didn't have. No, the other pilots stayed with me. Flew escort, watched on their sensors as my life support levels dropped into critical ranges. Listened on the comm as my breathing became labored, as the cockpit filled with carbon dioxide that my recycler could no longer process, as my body started shutting down from hypoxia. They couldn't help, couldn't share their oxygen. No, couldn't do anything except witness. I remember thinking very clearly as my vision started to gray that this was appropriate. This was how it should end. Not in combat, not fighting rebels, not dying for a cause or a mission, or even for the Empire. Just dying because a piece of equipment failed, because maintenance hadn't caught a problem, because the machine had stopped working, and I was too integrated into the machine to survive its failure. I remember my breathing slowing, the mechanical sound that had haunted me for 11 years becoming quieter, more distant, like listening to someone else dying in a cockpit beside me. I remember thinking about my family on Coruscant, wondering if they'd ever learned what I'd become, whether they'd be proud or ashamed or simply sad that I'd wasted my life in service of something that had stopped mattering years ago. I remember the hum, that omnipresent vibration that had been the soundtrack to my entire adult life, the sound of the Empire, the sound of the machine, the sound that would continue long after I was gone, because the machine didn't care about individual deaths. It would replace me, and would assign a new pilot to my squadron. Would keep functioning because that's what machines did. They continued. They persisted. They ground forward regardless of casualties, regardless of suffering, regardless of whether the purpose they served had any meaning beyond their own continuation. The shuttle arrived. Too late. They recovered my fighter with a tractor beam, pulled it into their bay, pressurized the compartment, opened my canopy. Found me slumped in my harness, not breathing, not responding. They tried to revive me. I felt hands on my chest, felt something being pressed over my face, felt pressure and pain, and the distant sensation of air being forced into lungs that had forgotten how to process it. And then I was breathing again, gasping, coughing, alive despite everything, despite the statistics, despite 11 years of trying to die honorably and ending up surviving dishonorably. The medica, a different one this time, younger, without the gray hair and tired eyesight, told me I'd been clinically dead for 90 seconds, told me I was lucky, told me I'd make a full recovery. I didn't feel lucky. I felt exhausted, used up, like I'd been given a reprieve I didn't deserve and didn't want. They took me back to the Star Destroyer. Medical evaluation. Time 3. Psychological assessment. The same process I'd been through a dozen times, except this time something was different. This time I couldn't hide what I felt anymore. Couldn't perform competence and confidence and the mechanical certainty that I was still fit for duty. This time, when they asked me questions about my readiness to return to combat, I couldn't make myself lie. They medically discharged me. Not because of the oxygen deprivation that had healed within days, leaving no permanent damage. They discharged me because the counselor determined I'd reached the threshold where continued combat exposure would result in diminished effectiveness, where the accumulated trauma had finally crossed the line from manageable to liability, where I'd stopped being an asset and become a problem that needed to be solved through reassignment to duties that didn't involve killing people. I should have felt relief. Should have felt grateful that I'd survived long enough to escape. Instead, I felt nothing, just the hum, echoing in my memory, continuing its eternal vibration, even though I was no longer aboard a Star Destroyer, no longer part of the machine, no longer a TIE fighter pilot. They gave me a pension, a commendation for distinguished service. a medal that meant nothing. They transferred me to a training facility on a quiet world in the core territories, a place where I was supposed to teach new pilots the same lessons I'd learned, prepare them for the same fate I'd barely survived. I tried. Stood in front of classrooms full of young men and women who still believed the propaganda, who still thought serving the Empire was noble, who still had hope that they'd be the ones who survived. I couldn't do it. Couldn't keep performing the lie. Couldn't send them to die for a cause I no longer believed in, if I'd ever believed in it at all. After 3 months, I resigned my commission. I gave up the pension, the benefits, the security that came from being a veteran of the Imperial Navy. Walked away from everything I'd been for 11 years, and tried to figure out who I might become now that I wasn't a pilot anymore. I moved to a colony world in the Outer Rim. Aljem Saudi Shas Adavitaris, a place far from Imperial centers of power, far from star destroyers and TIE fighters, and the hum that still echoed in my dreams. I found work doing maintenance on civilian spacecraft. Simple repairs, nothing complicated, nothing that required me to make decisions that might result in someone dying. I lived alone. Didn't form attachments. Didn't talk about my past. Just existed, day after day, trying to forget what I'd done and who I'd been, and the sound of my own breathing amplified through a helmet speaker. Years passed. The Empire fell. The Emperor died at Endor, killed by the same rebellion I'd spent 11 years trying to suppress. The New Republic rose from the ashes, promising democracy and freedom, and all the ideals the Empire had claimed to defend, but had actually destroyed. I watched it happen from a distance, felt nothing except a distant satisfaction that maybe all those deaths had meant something after all, even if what they'd meant was that the Empire I'd served deserved to die. I'm old now. My hands shake from nerve damage that the medics said was probably from long-term oxygen deprivation. My hearing is degraded from years of engine noise and weapons fire. My sleep is broken by nightmares where I'm back in the cockpit, sealed in, listening to my own breathing, knowing I'm going to die but unable to do anything except follow orders and hope that this time will be different. It's never different. I still hear the hum sometimes, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between heartbeats. That low-frequency vibration that defined my life for so long, that continues somewhere, even though the empire that generated it is gone, scattered across a galaxy that's trying to forget the decades of oppression and horror and systematic cruelty that was called order. People ask me sometimes what it was like to fly TIE fighters, to fight for the Empire, to survive when so many others died. I don't answer. Can't answer. Because the truth is too complicated and too simple at the same time. The truth is I was 19 years old and didn't know any better. The truth is I climbed into a cockpit and followed orders and killed people because that's what I was told to do. The truth is I survived through luck and numbness and a systematic suppression of everything that made me human. The truth is, I spent 11 years becoming a monster in service of a machine that didn't care about me. And now I spend every day trying to remember who I was before the machine, trying to find some version of myself that wasn't defined by the sound of my own desperate breathing, echoing in a cockpit coffin. I remember Gold Squadron sometimes, Gold Leader and Gold 2 through 6, whose names I never learned, who died during my first mission while I survived. I wonder if they had families who mourned them. Wonder if their deaths meant anything beyond a line in a casualty report. Russ, wonder if they understood, in their final moments, that they'd been sacrificed to a doctrine that valued speed over protection, numbers over lives, victory over mercy. I wonder if I'll ever stop hearing the hum. I wonder if I deserve to. The Empire called us defenders of order, heroes, instruments of galactic peace. The truth was simpler and darker. We were disposable. Pilots and disposable fighters, serving a disposable purpose, dying disposable deaths. And the ones who survived, who lived long enough to understand what we'd become. We ones who had to carry the weight of all those disposable deaths, had to remember the faces and the names, and the moments when we'd chosen survival over conscience. I survived, but I'm not sure I lived. And that's the most horrifying thing about being a TIE fighter pilot. Not the combat, not the casualties, not even the certain knowledge that you were going to die eventually in a machine that had no shields and no ejection system and no purpose except to kill or be killed. The most horrifying thing was realizing that death might have been easier than survival, that the ones who died quickly were the lucky ones, that the real price of service wasn't paid in the cockpit during those brief, violent moments when the universe tried to kill you. The real price was paid afterward, in the years that followed. In the quiet moments when the hum faded and you were left alone with your memories and your guilt and the impossible question of how to live with what you'd done. I hear my breathing still. That amplified mechanical rhythm. That sound that meant I was alive when others were dead. That sound that followed me out of the cockpit and into every moment afterward, a constant reminder that I survived by becoming exactly what the Empire needed me to be. A killer in a box. A servant of order. A TIE fighter pilot. Die? And that horror, the horror of what I chose